We are distinguishing between equity and equality, and we're also distinguishing between inequity and discrimination. So we're focusing on what the subgroups look like in comparison with each other, on the assumption that there should be some action taken, some policy action, some administrative action, some political action. There should be some action taken when those subgroup disparities are unacceptable to the relevant community, whether the system is doing a good job of fitting the resources to the actual needs of students. But the third bullet, I think, is one of the ways in which we think we kind of broke ground, in part because of the science of learning and development, and consistent with the intuitions that so many of us have had over the decades, over the generations. It's not just about what happens inside the classroom or the schoolhouse or even the education budget. It's also about the broader context that the student lives in, the context that produces so-called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, context that produces chronic stress, and the effects that those have on how a student navigates the social and academic challenges of school. One thing we wanted to do in this report is highlight the fact that the student context is actually part of the opportunity, or at least part of what informs the nature of the interventions and supports that are needed so that the student will be successful. This is not about ending poverty. That's a different committee. This one is about whether the adults in the system are doing their best at mitigating the effects of structural disadvantages of personal and community trauma. The interesting bureaucratic question is whether or not the adults that we're looking to, asking whether they're doing their best to fit resources to student needs, the adults should include those outside the school system. And the dollars brought to bear for the supports and interventions should include dollars that are not in the school budget.
When Chris said, are the adults sort of doing a good job? I think of that as like it's the State Department of Education as the big adult in the room doing a good job of making sure that resources and opportunities that are under its control are distributed in ways that are going to promote equitable development and learning. So we're not necessarily saying, oh, each community, the adults in that community, you have to figure out your own problem. That sort of takes some of the burden away from the system. I think we want to sort of think about the system level actors as, in some sense, the adults in the room.
How many school superintendents, district superintendents in your state show up at the annual budget hearing for the county mental health department? Because they're adults too. And people leading school systems should be advocates for getting those other child and family serving agencies to feel that they share responsibility for the success of students. Such important factors. Now, in an ideal world, the one we're moving toward, of course, there's a mechanism for some kind of collective accountability to make sure that the homelessness services are there, that the mental health services are there, that food insecurity is addressed, et cetera. But I really hope that looking at this set, especially the R&D indicators, it'll lead more and more education leaders to appreciate, to move that needle more than we've been able to with the lowest performing schools. We need to get some of the other adults into the picture. It's about educators holding themselves accountable for lassoing others to come and help. Not saying, oh, they should be doing something more. It's what are you doing? Are you doing what you can do to get them at the table? Many people think that the quote unquote report card function should be all about the outcomes. We are saying that while that's very important to track, and subgroup disparities in outcomes are critical to track if one is concerned with equity, it's also about the resources and the opportunities, broadly understood.
When thinking about indicators of equity, we want to think about them as answering the question, how well is the educational system distributing a kind of opportunity fairly or equitably across students of different groups. You might think of that at the state level. You might think of doing it also at the district level. So is a district distributing its teachers in an equitable way among schools? Is a school distributing them equitably among classrooms? The indicators could operate at different levels, but they're always answering the question of how equitably a resource or an opportunity is distributed, not just sort of measuring the level of that resource in the system or in a particular school. That shift to thinking about the distribution of opportunities in the system is an important piece of thinking about measuring equity. If I'm a low-performing district, I might want to know, are my students low-performing when they get to school and things are getting better or worse once they're in school? I would want to know sort of when developmentally do we start to see disparities in outcomes. If they're kind of there when kids get to kindergarten, but actually the disparities narrow the longer they're in my district, then I would want to say, let's focus some energy on providing more equal opportunities early on in kids' lives, preschool, childcare, family supports, as well as providing more, equitable opportunities early on in elementary school. But if they get to school with only modest disparities and those disparities get a lot worse while they're in my system, and particularly maybe in some grades than others, then that tells me I need to focus my attention on certain parts of my educational system, not on early childhood. And so one strategy is to sort of try to use the data we have to sort of figure out when developmentally we see the most inequity and when we're doing a good job, so that we know kind of not to focus on everything, but to focus on a particular developmental time period. So that would be one strategy.
If I'm a superintendent or I'm a principal, I'm most likely going to be judged by what happens with the average test score, as an example. But that creates an incentive to focus on a subset of students who are easier to lift. The idea of an equity indicator system is to avoid that and instead look at the gap. So the mere fact that the average goes up because you've focused on resources and those who are easiest to teach goes out in the wash, and you can focus on what's driving the differences in schools and ultimately in society. What we had in mind was trying to create the core of an indicator system with the expectation that jurisdictions would tailor their system to meet their needs by adding additional subgroups, for example, or adding additional indicators. And I think that is very important, because what's driving education policy choices and needs and wants obviously varies a lot from place to place. And the decision makers need to have indicator systems that are tailored to meet those local needs.